Hello, reading room. How are you? Happy New Year. We are here in 2024 and we are on day 108 of the classroom. Kind of took down my classroom for other purposes and now I put it back up. So, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. We finished that off in our last classroom, reading room. And now we are starting with a new book. And I thought I would do Heidi. So something that's all ages, a classic, a book that I got from a series of books that are just like this, from the publisher, just like this, on some of these classics. So you can get your hands on a bunch of these classics. And I got it from Commerce Township Library for, what was it, $4 a bag. All right, so this was written in, when? Where's the publisher? Doubleday. I don't see a date. Okay. I did look up the author. The author is Johanna Spyri. And this is a Swiss story that was written in German. So he's from Switzerland. Now, and I'll show you when there are pictures. Up to the Alm Uncle. That's the title of the chapter. Up to the Alm Uncle. From the pleasant village of Mayenfeld, a path leads through green fields, richly covered with trees, to the foot of the mountain, which from this side overhangs the valley with grave and solemn aspect. Where the path begins to grow steeper, begins also the heath with its short grass, and the perfume of sweet mountain plants seems to advance as if welcoming the traveler. From this spot, the footpath rises almost perpendicularly to the summit. Parallel, perpendicular. Along this steep mountain path, a stout, healthy girl was climbing one clear sunny morning in June, leading by the hand a child whose cheeks were so glowing red that she looked as if an inward flame were shining through her sunburned skin. And little wonder, for the child was as much wrapped up in this sunny June morning as if to protect her from bitter frost. The little girl could be scarcely more than 5 years old, but her natural size could not even be guessed at, for she had on 2, if not 3 dresses, one over the other, and over all, wound round and round, was a great red woolen shawl, so that the little shapeless figure, with its heavy hobnailed mountain shoes, toiled hot and weary up the steep hillside. Here's a pic. They had gone on this way for perhaps an hour from the valley when they reached the hamlet lying halfway up the elm, which is called Dorfli. Here the wanderers were hailed and greeted from almost every doorway, now from a window, and once from the road, for the girl had reached her native village. She did not know, however, pause at all, but answered all questions and greetings as she went along, till they reached the end of the hamlet, where only a few scattered cottages stood. Here someone called from a doorway, "Wait a minute, Deet, I will go with you if you are going farther." As Deet stood still, the child freed herself from her grasp and seated herself upon the ground. "Are you tired, Heidi?" asked her companion. "No, but hot," replied the child. "We are almost at the top. You must exert yourself a little more and take very long steps, and in an hour we shall be there," said Deet encouragingly. A broad, good-natured looking woman came from a doorway and joined the pair, and the little one followed the two old acquaintances who were deep in conversation about the inhabitants of Dorfli and surrounding cottages. "But where are you really taking the child, Deet?" asked the newcomer. "It is, of course, your sister's child, the one she left when she died." "It is," said Deet. "I am taking her up to the uncle's. She must stay with him." "What, leave this child with Elm Uncle?" "You have lost your senses, Deet. How can you think of such a thing? He will soon send you to the right about with your plans." "No, that cannot do. He is her grandfather and must do his share. I have cared for the child up to this time, and now, Barble, I have the offer of a situation which I cannot afford to lose because of this child. Let her grandfather now take his turn." "Yes, if he were like other people, Deet," rejoined Barble anxiously. "But there, you know all about that. What can he do with the child? Such a small one, too. It will never succeed. But where are you going?" "To Frankfurt," explained Deet, "where I am promised an unusually good place. The family were at the baths last summer. I had the care of their rooms in the hotel and looked after their comfort so well that they wanted to take me back with them then. Now they have come again and repeat their offer, and you may believe that I mean to accept this time. I should not like to be in this child's place," said Barble with a gesture of aversion. "No one knows how he lives up there. He will have nothing to do with other people year in, year out. He never sets foot in a church, and when he comes down here once a year with his thick stick, everyone avoids him and is afraid. With his thick gray eyebrows and his frightful beard, he looks so like a heathen and an Indian that everyone is thankful not to meet him in a solitary place alone. But for all that," said Deet defiantly, "he is the grandfather and must take care of the child. He will probably do her no harm, or will have to answer for it if he does. It is not my affair." "I shall really like to know," said Barble inquiringly, "what that old man has on his conscience that he casts such glances about him and lives all alone up there on the Alp and never lets himself be seen. They say all sorts of queer things about him, but you must know the truth from your sister. Do you not, Deet?" "Certainly, but I will not tell, for if he should ever know that I had said anything, what a scolding I should get." But Barble had long wanted to know why the Elm Uncle had such a look of dislike to other people, and why he lived alone up on the mountain, and why people spoke so cautiously about him, as if they could not say anything favorable and would not speak against him. Neither did Barble know why the old man was always called in Dorfli the Elm Uncle. He could not be the real uncle of all the inhabitants, but as they always called him, so she did the same. Barble had been married only a short time and came to live in the village after her wedding. She formerly lived in Pradequal and therefore did not know all of the ins and outs of life there, nor the peculiarities of the people in Dorfli and the neighborhood. Her good friend Deet, however, was born in Dorfli and had always lived there with her mother until her death. Then she went to Raggetsbad and served in the big hotel as chambermaid with very good wages. That very morning Deet had come with the child from Raggets. A friend had given them a ride in a hay cart as far as Mayenfeld. Barble, having learned this much, hastened to improve the opportunity to find out still more. So she laid her hand confidently on her friend's arm, saying, From you, Deet, one can know the real truth about the elm, uncle, and not be dependent on what the people here say. Do tell me, what is amiss with this old man? Has he always been feared and always seemed to hate his fellow beings as he does now? Okay, so we have two ladies. So here we've got the child all bundled up. And it looks like then this is Deet, right? So that's Deet, who is a woman. And Barble, who is also a woman, joins Deet and the child and is having this conversation. Whether he has always been like this, I cannot be expected to know exactly, as I am just 26 years old and he is at least 70. So you will not require me to tell you how he was when young. If I could only be sure that what I tell you will not be directly known in all prodigal, I might give you some information. For my mother and he both came from Damlesh. Oh, Deet, replied Barble, somewhat offended. What do you mean? They are not such terrible gossips in Patagow, after all, and I can keep a secret if necessary. So tell me, and you shall have never reason to be sorry for it. Well, I will, but mind you, keep your word, said Deet warningly. She turned to look behind to see if the child were near enough to hear what they said, but Heidi was nowhere to be seen. She must have ceased following for a long time, but they were too busy talking to notice her absence. Deet stopped and looked about in every direction. The path made one or two curves, but yet the eye could follow it almost down to Dorfleet. There was no one visible for its whole length. I see her now, exclaimed Barble. Down there, don't you see her? And she pointed to a spot quite distant from the mountain path. She is climbing up the cliff with Peter, the goat herd, and his flock. I wonder why he is so late today. It is lucky for us, for you can go on with your story while he looks after the child. It will not be necessary for Peter to exert himself much in looking after her, said Deet. She uses her own eyes and sees all that goes on. I have found that out, and it will be of use to her now, for the old man has only 2 goats and the elm hut. Did he once have more? Asked Barble. He? Yes, indeed. He had much more formerly, replied Deet eagerly. He had once the very best peasant's farm in Damlesh. He was the elder son and had only one brother who was quiet and steady, but the elder would do nothing but play the gentleman and travel through the country with bad company about whom no one knew anything. He lost his whole property at play and in extravagance, and when it became known, his father and mother died one after the other from mortification, and his brother was reduced to beggary and obliged to go no one knows where for vexation. Then the uncle, who no longer had anything but a bad name, also disappeared. At first no one knew where he had gone, but after a while they learned that he had joined the army and gone to Naples. Nothing more was known after 12 years or more. Then he all at once appeared in Damlesh with a half-grown boy and sought to introduce him to his relations there, but every door was closed against him. This made him very bitter. He said he would never set foot in Damlesh again, and so he came to Dorfleet. He lived here with his boy and must have had property, for he gave Tobias, his son, a trade. He was a nice fellow, a carpenter, and well liked by everyone in Dorfleet. But the old man trusted no one. It was said that he had deserted from Naples. He had a bad time of it, having killed someone, not in battle, you understand, but in a brawl. But we recognize the relationship because my great-grandmother and his mother were sisters, so we called him Uncle. And as we were related to everyone in Dorfleet on our father's side, gradually everybody called him Uncle. Since he was moved up there on the elm, he is known to everyone as the Elm Uncle. But what happened to Tobias? Asked Barble, who had listened eagerly. Only wait. I am coming to that. I can't tell everything at once. Tobias was sent to learn his trade in Mel's, and when he had learned it, he returned to Dorfli and married my sister Adelheid, whom he always liked. They were married, and they got along well enough together, but that did not last long. 2 years after his marriage, as he was helping to build a house, a beam fell on him and killed him, and he was brought all crushed to his home. Adelheid fell ill from the shock and from sorrow and had a fever from which she never recovered. She, who was formerly so strong and hardy, fell often into swoons, so that one could not tell if she were waking or asleep. Only 2 months after Tobias's death, we buried Adelheid. Everybody was talking far and wide of sad fate of those two, and they said softly and then aloud that it was punishment that the uncle deserved for his godless life, and the pastor, appealing to his conscience, told him that he must now do penance. But he became more and more gloomy and morose, spoke to no one, and at last everyone avoided him. Then we heard that he had gone up to the elm, never coming down, but living a solitary life at war with God and man. We took Adelheid's little child to live with us, my mother and I. Heidi was a year old. Then after my mother's death, I decided to go to the baths to earn something, and taking with the child with me, I gave her in charge of old Ursel in Pfefferserdorf. Pfefferserdorf. I could remain at the baths during the winter, for there was plenty of work for me, and I can sew and mend very nicely. The same family returned early this spring from Frankfurt, whom I served last year, and they again wish to take me back. So I'm going the day after tomorrow, and it is a good place, I assure you. And you will leave the child up there with that old man? I cannot understand what you are thinking of, Diet, said Barble reproachfully. What do you mean by that? Answered Diet. I have done my share for the child, and what more can I do? It is not to be expected that I can carry a child 5 years old to Frankfurt with me. Well, where are you going, Barble? Here we are already halfway up the Alm. I'm almost come to the place, said Barble. I have something to say to my mother of Peter, the goatherd. She spins for me in the winter. So goodbye, Diet. Good luck to you. Diet held out her hand to her companion and stood still while the latter went toward the small dark brown cottage, which stood a little way from the path in a hollow where it was somewhat protected from the mountain winds. Standing halfway up the Alm, it was fortunately situated in the sheltered hollow, and yet looked so crazy and weather-worn that it must have been a dangerous dwelling when the full wind blew strongly over the elm, making everything shake and tremble, and setting all the rotten beams a-creaking. It could not have been stood long in its present condition on the summit, but would speedily have been swept down into the valley. This was the dwelling of Goat Peter, the 11-year-old boy, whose business it was to drive the goats from Dorfli every morning up onto the elm, to let them pasture on the short, succulent bushes that grow there. In the evening, he led the nimble-footed herd down into Dorfli again and gave a shrill whistle on his fingers as the sound of which the owners came to the little square to fetch the animals that belonged to them. Generally, little boys and girls came for the animals. Such gentle creatures could do no harm, and thus Peter was for a short time every day with companions of his own age. Otherwise, he lived during the entire summer only with his goats. To be sure, he had his mother and his blind grandmother, but he left the hut early in the morning and returned late from Dorfli because he liked to amuse himself with the children there as long as possible, spending only enough time at home to swallow his bread and milk as fast as he could, to get off early with the goats in the morning and to his pillow at night. His father, who followed the same business and was also called Goat Peter, had been killed while felling wood the year before. His mother, whose name was Bridget, was also spoken of as Goat Peterin, or Goat Peter's mother, from the connection, and for everybody far and near, his blind grandmother had the same name. Deed stood waiting for certainly 10 minutes, looking in every direction for the children and the goats, who were nowhere to be seen. Then she climbed still higher to get a view of the valley, searching in every direction with signs of increasing impatience on her face and in her movements. In the meantime, the children had gone round in quite another direction, for Peter knew of many spots where all sorts of bushes and herbs grew that were good for his goats to nibble at, and to reach which he twisted and turned about from one place to another with his flock. At first Heidi climbed after him, but with greatest difficulty, enveloped as she was in her heavy wraps and suffering from her weight and moreover from heat. She was obliged to exalt all her little strength. She said nothing, however, but looked fixedly at Peter, who with his bare feet and light trousers sprang here and there without the least trouble. Then she observed the goats, which with their thin, slender legs climbed still more easily over the stocks and stones and even up the precipices. Suddenly the child sat down, pulled off shoes and stockings as quickly as possible, stood up again, threw off the thick red shawl, unfastened her dress, cast that away, and had still another to strip off, for Deed had put on all the child's Sunday clothes over her everyday garments for convenience sake, so that no one else need carry them. In a twinkling the child tore off all her everyday dress too, and stood in her light petticoat, stretching her bare arm with delight out of the short sleeves of her little shirt into the cooling wind. Then she folded all her clothes together into a neat little heap, and leaving them, climbed up after the goats to Peter, going with them as lightly and easily as the very best. Peter had not noticed what the child was about while she stayed behind, but when she sprung up beside him in her new dress, he grinned in the most comical way. Then looking back, he perceived the little heap of clothes, and his grin became wider until his mouth seemed to extend from ear to ear, but he said never a word. Now that the child felt herself so free and comfortable, she began to talk to her companions, and he had to answer all sorts of questions. She wanted to know how many goats he had, where he was taking them, and what he did when he reached his destination. At last, however, the children and the goats reached the hut when Aunt Dietz caught sight of them. As soon as the latter saw the little company of climbers, she shouted, "What are you about, Heidi? How you look! What have you done with your 2 dresses and the shawl and the new shoes that I bought for you for the mountain, and the new stockings I knit you myself? Are they all gone?" "All? Heidi, what have you done with them?" The child pointed quietly down the mountainside, saying only, "There." Deet looked and followed the direction of the child's finger. She saw something lying on the top of which was a red spot. "Could that be the shawl? You mischievous child," she cried in great excitement. "What are you thinking of? Why have you taken everything off? What does it mean?" "I do not need them," replied the child, and did not look sorry for what she had done. "Oh, you unlucky, thoughtless Heidi, have you no idea about things?" said Deet, scolding and complaining at the same time. "Who is to go down for them? It will be at least a half-hour's work. Come, Peter, run down and fetch them for me. Don't stand there staring as if you were nailed to the ground." "I am too late already," said he slowly, and stood without stirring from the spot, with his hands in his pockets. Just as he stood, when Deet's cry of alarm first reached his ears. "You stand there and open your eyes as wide as you can, but do not stir," cried Aunt Deet to him again. "Come now, you shall have something nice. Do you see this?" showing him a new shining 3-penny piece. In an instant, he ran down the mountain, taking the shortest way, and reaching the clothes by great strides, seized them in his arms, and was back so quickly that Deet was forced to praise him, while she gave him the promised 3-penny piece without delay. Peter stuck it quickly deep into his pocket, while his face beamed and shone with pleasure, for a like treasure rarely fell to his lot. "You can carry the bundle for us up to the uncle's. You are going that way, I believe," said Deet, while she applied herself to climbing the steep path that made an abrupt ascent from behind the goat herd's hut. He was quite ready and followed her, carrying the bundle under his left arm, while he swung his rod with his right. Heidi and the goats sprang joyfully about in every direction. In this manner, the little procession reached at last the summit of the elm. After about 3/4 of an hour's climbing, there stood the uncle's hut, exposed, it is true, to all the winds of heaven, but getting the advantage of every ray of sunlight and commanding, too, a most beautiful view of the valley. Behind the hut stood 3 big, very old pine trees with long, thick, untrimmed branches, and then the mountain background rose up to the old gray rocks, first over beautiful slopes covered with succulent herbs, and then through thickly strewn boulders, and at last came the bald, steep pinnacles. On the side of his hut, overlooking the valley and fastened there securely, the uncle had placed a bench. Here he was now seated, his pipe in his mouth, his hands resting on his knees, looking quietly down at the children, the goats, and Aunt Deet as they came clambering up. Heidi reached the summit first, and going directly toward the old man, stretched out her hand to him, saying, "Good morning, grandfather." "Well, well, what does this mean?" answered Uncle harshly. He gave his hand, however, to the child, looking at her with a long, piercing gaze from under his bushy eyebrows. Heidi returned his look with equal steadiness, not once letting her eyes swerve from his face. Such a strange-looking man as her grandfather, with his long beard, his gray eyebrows growing together in the middle like a bush, seemed to her worthy of study. In the meantime, Deet and the goat herd stood behind Heidi, Peter looking on to see what was to happen. "I wish you good day, Uncle," said Deet, stepping up. "I bring you Tobias and Aldehyde's child. You will scarcely recognize her, for you have not seen her since she was a year old." "And what has the child to do with me?" asked the old man. "You there," he called out to Peter. "Go on with your goats. You are none too early. Take mine along with you." Peter heard and obeyed, for the uncle had looked at him, and that was enough. "The child must stay here with you," asserted Deet. "I have done my share for her these 4 years past. Now it's your turn." "Indeed," said the old man, casting a withering glance at Deet. "And if the child begins to cry for you and whimper as these senseless little creatures do, what is to be done then?" "This is your affair," said Deet. "I mean, no one told me how I was to manage with her when she was thrown on my hands, a year-old child, and I had already as much as I could do for my mother and myself. Now I must go with my employers, and you are the next of kin to the child. If you won't keep her, do with her as you like. If anything happens to her, you know, there will be no further trouble." Deet's conscience was not easy about this proceeding, and therefore she was working herself into a passion and said more than she really meant. As she uttered these last words, the uncle stood up. So there's our picture. And looked at her so strangely that she involuntarily drew back several steps. He stretched forth his arm and said in a commanding voice, "Go back to the place from whence you came, and do not show yourself here again in a hurry." Then farewell, and you also, Heidi, said Diet, not meaning to wait for a repetition of these words, and she ran down the mountainside without stopping till she reached Dorfli, for her inward excitement drove her onward as if she were impelled by steam. And Dorfli, everybody called out to her even more clamorously than before, for all were curious to know what had become of the child. They knew Diet very well and to whom the child belonged and all her family history. So they called from door to and window, "Where's the child? What have you done with the little one, Diet?" Here's a close-up picture of Elm Uncle. She shouted back impatiently without stopping. "Up there with Uncle, I say. Don't you understand?" But she was very uncomfortable, for the women all exclaimed, "How could you do such a thing? That poor child! The idea of leaving such a helpless child up there," and again. "The poor little tot," and so on and so on. Diet ran on as quickly as possible and was soon beyond the reach of their voices, for she was not happy about her conduct, as her mother had given the child into her charge on her deathbed. But she tried to quiet her conscience by saying to herself that she could do more for the child when she had earned something. It was a relief to get away as quickly as possible from her old friends, who questioned her too closely, and to go into service with a good family. Okay, so thanks for joining me back here in the classroom with a new book in our reading room. We are reading the classic story Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow.